The flashing lights hit the rear view mirror out of nowhere. Your stomach tightens instantly. Maybe you were just driving home after work. Maybe you were coming back from a long trip. Maybe you weren't even speeding. But the second those lights appear behind you, everything changes. Your hands suddenly feel awkward on the steering wheel. You start replaying the last 5 miles in your head, trying to figure out what you did wrong. Then the officer walks up slowly, shining a flashlight through the windows like he's searching for something before he even says hello. And in this situation, one detail changes everything. Not the car, not the license, not even whether you broke a traffic law. It's how the interaction starts. Have you ever been stopped by police or border patrol and felt like the questioning went way beyond what should have happened? Tell me what happened in the comments, because a lot of drivers don't realize how quickly a simple stop can turn into pressure, intimidation, and extended detention, even when officers eventually find absolutely nothing. And later on, I'm going to explain one mistake people make during these encounters that quietly gives officers far more control than most drivers understand. The thing that throws people off with border patrol stops is that many drivers assume the rules are completely different from ordinary police encounters. And to be fair, the atmosphere does feel different. There's usually more tension from the beginning, more authority in the tone, more direct commands, sometimes multiple agents standing around the vehicle, sometimes questions repeated over and over in slightly different ways. Where are you headed? Where are you coming from? How long were you there? Who owns the vehicle? What's in the trunk? Then, after you answer, another agent asks almost the exact same thing again, like they didn't hear you the first time. That repetition isn't random. A lot of drivers think officers repeat questions because they're confused or disorganized. Most of the time, they're watching consistency. They're studying hesitation. They're observing eye movement, tone changes, nervous swallowing, breathing patterns, hand movements, and timing between responses. People don't realize how much of a stop is psychological before it ever becomes legal. And here's where situations start going sideways for innocent drivers. The average person gets nervous during any law enforcement stop, even when they've done nothing wrong. Heart rate goes up. Memory gets messy. People accidentally misspeak. Someone says they left Dallas at 2 p.m., then later says maybe it was closer to 3. Suddenly the officer becomes more suspicious, not less. That's one of the reasons these roadside encounters become dangerous in a legal sense. Innocent nervousness often looks identical to guilty nervousness. Officers know this, but they also know nervousness can justify extending interactions while they figure things out. Now imagine a border patrol scenario near an immigration checkpoint or during a roving patrol stop. The agent approaches the vehicle already operating with a heightened suspicion mindset. Maybe they claim the driver avoided eye contact. Maybe the vehicle slowed down strangely before the checkpoint. Maybe the passenger appeared stiff and silent. Maybe luggage placement looked unusual. Sometimes the reasons sound thin because honestly, sometimes they are thin. And once an officer starts building suspicion mentally, every small detail starts fitting into that narrative. The driver clears his throat too much. The passenger looks forward instead of turning. There's fast food in the car suggesting long-distance travel. There are blankets in the back seat. The driver's hands shake while handing over documents. Most ordinary people have no idea how ordinary behavior gets interpreted during stops. Now let's talk about the kind of situation that really frustrates viewers. The officer or agent keeps someone detained, starts hinting at force, talks aggressively, maybe even threatens to remove them physically from the vehicle, and after all that pressure, they eventually find nothing illegal whatsoever. You see people online all the time saying, well, if you've got nothing to hide, just cooperate. That sounds simple until you actually live through one of these encounters, because the pressure itself changes people. Imagine sitting there while an agent says something like, if you don't step out voluntarily, we can make this happen another way. Or, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Or the classic, why are you so nervous if you've done nothing wrong? Now think about what that does psychologically. The average driver immediately feels trapped between asserting rights and avoiding escalation. That's where many people panic and start talking too much. And this is the part most drivers misunderstand completely. Officers are trained to keep conversations flowing because talking creates opportunities. Silence limits opportunities. Every extra sentence introduces potential inconsistencies, admissions, contradictions, or behavioral observations. A driver trying desperately to sound innocent often creates more suspicion accidentally. That's why some of the most damaging moments during traffic stops happen when people start volunteering information nobody asked for. I'm just tired. I've been driving all day. My cousin borrowed the car last week. There shouldn't be anything illegal in there. Notice that last sentence. There shouldn't be. That single phrase can completely change the atmosphere of a stop. Suddenly the officer hears uncertainty. Now they think maybe the driver suspects something illegal could actually be inside the vehicle. One poorly worded sentence can extend the stop dramatically, and passengers make this worse all the time without realizing it. One passenger says they're headed to Arizona. The driver says Nevada first, then Arizona. Now officers separate the stories mentally. One person says they stayed 2 days, another says 3. Tiny inconsistencies become fuel for prolonged questioning. What makes Border Patrol encounters especially uncomfortable is that agents often rely heavily on authority pressure early in the interaction. They may stand unusually close to the vehicle. They may angle flashlights into every corner of the cabin. Sometimes they lean silence against you intentionally. That uncomfortable pause after a question isn't always accidental. Anything illegal in the vehicle? Silence. The driver shifts uncomfortably. The officer keeps staring. People rush to feel silence because silence feels threatening. And once people start feeling silence emotionally, they usually overshare. Now let's get into something drivers rarely think about until it's too late: document retention. A lot of people don't realize how psychologically controlling it feels when an officer keeps your license and registration longer than expected. The stop may technically feel temporary, but practically speaking, most people don't believe they're free to leave while the officer still possesses their identification. So what happens? The driver mentally transitions from citizen to subject, and that changes behavior. People become more compliant, more eager to please, more willing to answer questions they otherwise might avoid. This is where prolonged roadside conversations often begin drifting far beyond the original reason for the stop. A driver thinks, if I just keep cooperating, this will end faster. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it absolutely is not. Because once officers sense they can continue probing without resistance, the questioning can expand rapidly. Mind if we take a look inside? You don't have any drugs, right? No weapons? Why'd you pause before answering? And notice something important here. Officers often ask questions in escalating layers, not because they already know something, but because they're testing reactions. Most people focus only on words. Officers focus heavily on delivery. How fast did the driver answer? Did the passenger interrupt? Did someone suddenly stop making eye contact? Did the driver become defensive too quickly? You could have a completely innocent driver whose nervous behavior accidentally creates an investigative spiral. Now here's where people get themselves into serious trouble trying to sound smart online. You'll see videos where somebody treats the stop like a courtroom battle immediately. Instant hostility, instant aggression, interrupting every sentence, refusing basic instructions in the most confrontational tone possible. That strategy can become dangerous fast. There's a difference between calmly asserting rights and escalating tension emotionally. Officers are human beings operating under uncertainty during roadside encounters. If your behavior suddenly becomes unpredictable, aggressive, or erratic, officers may shift into a safety-focused mindset immediately. And once that happens, the tone changes. Hands move closer to equipment. Backup gets requested. Commands become shorter and louder. This is why emotional control matters more than people think. The driver who stays calm often maintains more practical control over the situation than the driver trying to win the interaction verbally. Now that doesn't mean officers are always justified, far from it. Some stops absolutely become fishing expeditions. Some officers push boundaries aggressively. Some rely on intimidation because they know many citizens don't understand legal limits under pressure. And Border Patrol situations especially create confusion because people assume constitutional protections somehow disappear entirely near checkpoints or border zones. That misunderstanding alone causes many drivers to surrender far more information than necessary. One thing officers understand very well is that most people hate uncertainty more than almost anything else. So when an officer says, "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," that sentence carries enormous psychological weight even if nothing illegal has been found. Drivers immediately start imagining worst-case scenarios: arrest, handcuffs, vehicle seizure, force, public embarrassment, being held for hours, missing work. And under that pressure, people consent to things they otherwise wouldn't. That's why consent searches become such a huge issue during roadside stops. Many people don't realize they technically had a choice because the environment itself feels coercive. An officer asks casually, "You don't mind if I check real quick, do you?" But the atmosphere doesn't feel casual at all. Lights flashing, armed agents nearby, documents still retained, tone becoming sharper. Most ordinary people hear that question as a command. Now here's something important that rarely gets explained clearly. Refusing consent does not automatically mean officers stop investigating. Some drivers believe refusing a search ends the encounter immediately. That's not reality. Officers may still attempt to develop independent probable cause through observation, canine deployment, questioning, or other investigative methods. But there's another side people ignore. Consenting to searches can create enormous problems even for innocent people. Why? Because many drivers genuinely do not know every item inside their vehicle. Borrowed backpacks, old prescription bottles, a friend's property, loose ammunition forgotten after a range trip. Even legal items can create extended roadside complications depending on local laws, context, or officer interpretation. And here's where innocent people often make catastrophic mistakes. During prolonged questioning, they begin trying too hard to prove innocence emotionally. "I swear I'm not a criminal. I've never been arrested. You can trust me." The problem is, officers don't evaluate innocence based on emotional declarations. They evaluate observable evidence and behavioral indicators. Emotional persuasion attempts often accomplish nothing except extending conversation. There's another psychological layer happening during these stops that drivers rarely recognize in real time. Authority conditioning. Most people have spent their entire lives being taught to comply immediately with authority figures to avoid conflict. Teachers, supervisors, security personnel, police. So when an officer becomes stern or forceful, many drivers instinctively become submissive, even when confused about what's happening legally. That conditioning gets amplified during border patrol encounters because federal authority carries a heavier psychological presence for many people. The uniforms, the tactical posture, the references to immigration enforcement, the implication of national security concerns. Even completely lawful drivers start feeling like suspects before any evidence exists. Now imagine an agent saying, "Step out of the vehicle." Most people instantly feel panic because they associate exiting the car with arrest. But legally, officers often can order occupants out during lawful traffic stops. The problem is, drivers frequently react emotionally instead of strategically. Some refuse immediately, some argue emotionally, some suddenly make fast movements, grabbing phones or bags. That's where situations become dangerous very quickly. Officers are hyper-alert during vehicle exits because movement changes risk calculations. A driver reaching suddenly toward the center console may think they're grabbing insurance paperwork while the officer interprets possible weapon access. Timing matters. Hand placement matters. Tone matters. Even facial expressions matter more than people realize. A driver rolling eyes dramatically or muttering under their breath may think they're expressing frustration. The officer may interpret hostility or escalation risk. Now let's talk about repeated questioning, because this tactic frustrates people constantly. An officer asks where you're traveling. 5 minutes later, another officer asks again. Then later, "So remind me where you said you were coming from." People get irritated because they think officers are ignoring previous answers intentionally. Sometimes they are. Repetition tests consistency under stress. Innocent people generally maintain core details even when nervous, but prolonged stress can still create accidental contradictions. And once contradictions appear, officers often mentally upgrade suspicion. This becomes even more problematic when passengers start talking independently. Passengers frequently think they're helping by volunteering details. In reality, they may unintentionally create discrepancies officers seize upon immediately. One passenger says the trip was spontaneous. The driver previously described it as planned. Now officers start wondering why stories differ. Again, innocent explanations exist constantly. Human memory is messy, communication is imperfect. But roadside investigations aren't calm academic discussions. Officers are making fast judgments under uncertainty. Now let's address the moment many viewers find most disturbing: threats of force before evidence is discovered. This is where people emotionally disconnect from the idea of fairness. Because from the civilian perspective, it feels backward. Why threaten force if no crime has been proven? But officers often frame these situations around compliance rather than guilt. That distinction matters. If an officer gives a lawful command and believes a driver may resist physically, they may escalate verbal warnings early to establish control before resistance develops. The problem is, citizens experiencing that moment often feel intimidated regardless of legality, especially when the stop ultimately reveals nothing illegal. That creates lasting distrust. And honestly, some officers communicate terribly during these encounters. Instead of reducing tension, they increase it unnecessarily through sarcasm, aggressive phrasing, or dominance-based behavior. You think this is a joke? You want to play games tonight? Keep testing me. Those kinds of statements instantly raise emotional temperature. Now imagine sitting there innocent while hearing that tone directed at you. Your pulse spikes, your thinking narrows, you become more likely to make mistakes. And mistakes during traffic stops can snowball fast. One overlooked reality is that officers often interpret non-compliance differently than civilians do. A civilian may think they're calmly questioning authority. The officer may perceive delay, resistance, or tactical stalling. That gap in perception creates many roadside escalations. For example, an officer says, "Exit the vehicle." The driver responds, "Am I being detained?" The officer repeats the command louder. The driver keeps debating instead of moving. Now tension escalates not necessarily because of the legal question itself, but because timing and context transform the interaction into a control issue. People watching edited internet clips often miss how rapidly these moments evolve in real time. Seconds matter. Body movement matters. Tone shifts matter. And once adrenaline enters the encounter heavily, communication quality usually collapses on both sides. Now here's something many drivers never consider. Officers are also evaluating whether occupants might flee. That concern changes behavior dramatically during prolonged stops. If officers believe someone may attempt escape, commands become more rigid and physical positioning changes. That's why agents sometimes stand in ways that block doors or movement paths subtly. They're controlling space. Roadside policing is heavily about environmental control. Who stands where, who moves first, who controls timing, who asks questions, who retains documents. Even silence becomes a tactical tool. A lot of drivers also misunderstand canine deployments during extended stops. People assume dogs appear randomly. Usually officers are trying to avoid crossing legal timing boundaries improperly while still developing grounds for deeper investigation. That's why duration matters so much. What started as a 5-minute interaction slowly becomes 20 minutes, because officers continue layering observations and questions. And innocent drivers often accidentally help extend that timeline themselves through nervous over-explaining. Here's a scenario people rarely think through carefully. An officer asks, "You mind waiting a few more minutes?" Most people instinctively say yes because refusing feels confrontational. But that simple agreement can alter how the encounter unfolds legally and practically. Again, this is why understanding psychological pressure matters more than memorizing internet slogans. Real traffic stops are messy. People are emotional. Officers are suspicious. Nobody has perfect information. And the environment itself pushes ordinary citizens toward compliance through stress and uncertainty. One of the biggest myths online is that there's some magic sentence guaranteeing immediate release during police encounters. There isn't. No clever phrase suddenly shuts down an investigation instantly. No viral script makes roadside tension disappear. What actually helps most is emotional discipline combined with clear thinking. The drivers who avoid making situations worse usually share certain behaviors. They move slowly. They avoid sudden emotional swings. They don't volunteer endless explanations. They understand that irritation from officers doesn't automatically require emotional retaliation. And they recognize something critical. The roadside is usually not the place where legal disputes get fully resolved. That frustrates people because emotionally they want fairness immediately. They want the officer to admit suspicion was wrong right there on the shoulder of the highway. But that rarely happens. Instead, many encounters end awkwardly. Documents returned. Brief explanation. "All right, you're free to go." And after 30 stressful minutes, the driver sits there furious because nothing illegal was ever found in the first place. That emotional aftermath sticks with people for years, especially when threats or intimidation occurred during the stop. A person starts questioning everything afterward. Was the stop legitimate? Did I accidentally surrender rights? Could I have handled it differently? Did my nervousness make things worse? Should I have stayed silent more? And honestly, sometimes the answer is yes. People underestimate how much their own behavior shapes the trajectory of encounters. Not because officers are always right, but because roadside interactions are deeply reactive environments. An officer becomes suspicious. The driver senses suspicion and grows anxious. The officer notices anxiety and increases scrutiny. The driver feels targeted and becomes defensive. Now both sides are feeding each other's tension. That loop happens constantly during traffic stops. And Border Patrol encounters amplify it because National Security Authority carries heavier emotional pressure than ordinary speeding tickets. Another issue people rarely discuss honestly is pride. Some drivers become so focused on proving they know their rights that they stop evaluating practical risk moment to moment. That can become dangerous. There's a difference between preserving legal rights and escalating ego conflicts. A roadside shoulder at night with armed officers is not a debate stage. That doesn't mean surrender every right automatically. It means understanding timing, psychology, and consequences. Sometimes the smartest move is calm restraint, even when you feel disrespected. And that's difficult for many people because disrespect triggers emotional reactions fast, especially if officers appear dismissive, sarcastic, or accusatory. Now let's talk about something subtle but incredibly important. Officers often pay attention to what happens before they even approach the vehicle. People think the interaction starts at the window. It usually starts much earlier. Did the driver take unusually long to pull over? Did occupants move around excessively after stopping? Did someone lean toward the floorboard? Did windows stay partially closed? Did passengers suddenly stop talking? Officers build narratives quickly from pre-contact behavior. Sometimes those narratives are accurate. Sometimes completely innocent conduct gets interpreted suspiciously. For example, a driver searching frantically for registration paperwork before the officer approaches may look like concealment movements from outside the vehicle. A passenger turning around to grab a jacket may appear like hiding contraband temporarily. This is why calm, visible movements matter so much during stops. And yet anxiety causes people to do the exact opposite. Fast movements, chaotic searching, talking over each other, interrupting, explaining too much. The stop spirals from there. One thing experienced officers understand well is that uncertainty creates compliance. If drivers don't know exactly where legal boundaries exist, they tend to comply broadly just to end discomfort. That's why prolonged ambiguity becomes powerful. Hang tight for me. Just waiting on something. We're almost done. Meanwhile, 15 more minutes pass. The driver doesn't know whether they can leave, refuse further questioning, or challenge delays effectively in the moment. And under stress, most people default toward patience rather than confrontation. Now think about the emotional impact when after all that pressure, all the implied suspicion, all the aggressive questioning, officers ultimately find nothing. No drugs, no warrants, no trafficking, nothing illegal. That's when drivers often realize the true emotional cost of these encounters. Even innocent people walk away shaken, not because they were physically harmed necessarily, but because sustained authority pressure changes people psychologically, especially first-time encounters. Some drivers become hyper-anxious every time they see police afterward. Some start overcompensating during future stops. Others become immediately hostile due to accumulated resentment. Neither extreme usually helps. The reality most people don't want to hear is that traffic stops exist in a gray zone between legal theory and human psychology. The law matters enormously, but so do timing, perception, fear, tone, uncertainty, and emotional control. And this is the important mistake I mentioned earlier that many drivers never realize until it's too late. They focus so heavily on proving innocence that they stop managing the interaction itself. Those are two different things. You can be completely innocent and still handle a stop poorly. You can legally assert rights while accidentally escalating suspicion through emotional behavior. You can create unnecessary complications simply because stress overrides judgment. That doesn't justify improper police conduct. But understanding the reality of roadside dynamics gives drivers a better chance of protecting themselves practically, not just theoretically. Because out there on the roadside, with lights flashing and officers staring into the vehicle waiting for reactions, Nobody cares how confident you sounded watching internet videos at home. What matters is whether you can stay calm while your heart is pounding, whether you can think clearly while authority pressure builds, whether you can avoid talking yourself into deeper problems, whether you understand that silence feels uncomfortable precisely because investigators want it to, and whether you recognize the moment an encounter shifts from routine questioning into something more serious before your own emotions make the situation worse. That awareness changes everything. Because sometimes the most important part of a traffic stop is not what officers find. It's how quickly an ordinary person loses control of their own thinking under pressure without even realizing it happened.